Hey there and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I sincerely hope that wherever you are in the world right now, that you and your family are in good health and in peace as we all worldwide navigate through this very weird and challenging situation together and yet apart. So I know that quite a few of you are using this time that you're spending indoors to work on your art, which I think is absolutely amazing. And this is why this week I wanted to share a beginner-friendly video here on YouTube. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing two different mixed media abstract explorations that I created using primarily watercolor. A couple of other mediums get brought in at the end, but it's mostly watercolor. And this is an awesome exercise for beginners just getting started with this medium because it allows you to explore and get to know the medium and how it behaves in a less constricted, overwhelming, and more intuitive and fun kind of way. So let's get into the video. Alright everyone, so I'm going to be sharing, as I said in the beginning of this video, two little abstract explorations that I created using watercolor, ink, and white gouache. This first one is going to be blue and yellow, and the second one is going to be purple and orange. If you'd like to jump straight to the second one, then make sure to check out the timestamp that I left down below for you in the description box of this video. I'm also going to be leaving you a second timestamp in there for the exact point in the video in which I start sharing the specific tips in case you'd like to jump straight to that as well. Before I get into the tips that I want to share with you today in regards to mixed media abstract explorations, I just really wanted to share some information and some things that I feel could be helpful for people just getting started. I do want to talk a little bit about why I think these kinds of explorations are so helpful for beginners just getting started with watercolor. I also wanted to share a bit about the specific techniques that I use to create these pieces, especially when it comes to watercolor, which is going to help me provide a bit of insight as to my thought process as I'm moving along with something this intuitive. So if that sounds like something that could be helpful for you, then I would make sure to watch this first part of the video too. Before getting started with all of that, I want to talk a little bit about the specific watercolor painting supplies that I use to create these pieces, as well as the other supplies that I use. In terms of my paper, I use my Arches cold press 140-pound watercolor paper. And I wouldn't use anything that is lighter or thinner than 140 pounds for this kind of painting, especially because we're using so much wet on wet for this and so much layering. The paint that I am using is from my St. Petersburg White Nights 12 color paint set. If you've been a subscriber here at my channel for a while and you've watched other of my watercolor painting videos, then you're probably already well aware that I really love keeping my color schemes limited. I like giving thought to color prior to getting started with the actual painting process because color is such a huge part behind making a piece look harmonious and cohesive. And whatever it is I am painting, whether it's something representational or completely abstract like this, I like bringing in my knowledge of the color wheel and of tried and true color schemes, which I'm going to be talking about later on in this video, to select my colors intentionally in order to achieve the level of contrast or the overall outcome that I am looking for using only a limited amount of colors. Sometimes I use as little as 3 colors to create an entire piece, and maximum I would say I would use around 7 if I am creating a very complex composition made out of a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and things like that. So all I am saying here is it's super useful to start giving thought to color prior to actually getting started with your painting process. I'll be talking more about this in a bit. For this first one, I used a total of 4 colors, which were lemon yellow, yellow ochre, phthalo blue, and black. And for the second one, I used 5 different colors, and those were cadmium yellow medium, cadmium red light, carmine, phthalo blue, and black. In terms of my paintbrushes, I used 3 from Royal and Langnickel's Watercolor Zen line set. I used one 1-inch flat brush and 2 rounds in sizes 14 and 12. And I also brought in a quill brush from Princeton in size 6. I knew this brush would come in handy for this splattering technique because it holds a lot of water in its bristles. And this is honestly the most expensive brush that I have right now when it comes to watercolor painting. All of my other brushes from Royal and Langnickel that you're gonna see me use are super accessible, and they honestly work perfectly for me because with my painting style and the techniques that I personally like using, which can certainly be pretty abrasive, I like doing lots of layering, I like doing scrubbing, and to be honest, I don't take care of my brushes as well as I should. So my brushes from Royal and Langnickel are super affordable, they are very durable, they feel very good in my hand, and I'm not gonna feel bad if anything happens to them and they need to be replaced. For my ink line work that I'm going to be adding near the finishing stages of these paintings, I am using my Staedtler pigment liner in 0.2. And for the white gouache that I am adding at the end, I am using Winsor & Newton's Designer's Gouache in permanent white. To apply my white gouache at the end, I used a very fine detailing brush that I rarely use for my actual watercolor paintings. I often get asked where I bought my watercolor paint mixing palette. I bought it via Amazon, and if you're interested, the link to all of these watercolor painting supplies are going to be left down below for you in the description box. Which, by the way, I am so very thankful to everyone that has used my links to check out items over on Amazon, because with everything that you buy, I receive a tiny little commission at no extra cost to you, and I use these little earnings to help me buy more supplies so that I can keep creating videos for you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So moving on to the next thing that I wanted to explain about, and this is why I think that these kinds of studies or explorations or whatever you'd like to call them are so valuable for people just getting started with this medium. And just in case this is the first video that you're watching of mine, I consider myself much more of a representational artist, meaning that I usually create paintings or drawings of specific things, of recognizable subjects or objects, right? Over at my channel, you're gonna find painting videos or drawing videos in which I'm painting animals or landscapes or faces, specific things. However, this kind of abstract exploration is very, very helpful to start gaining confidence with a medium, to start getting to know its characteristics, the way it works. They help us practice our water control, which is an unbelievably important skill to start mastering. They help us start getting comfortable with color and color mixing. And they are also an amazing opportunity to start exploring different techniques, such as wet on wet, wet on dry, splattering, dry brushing, bleeding, etc. And getting to know about how the medium behaves, what happens when you take certain actions, or what you have to do in order to create certain visual effects. Not to mention, with these abstract pieces, we also start practicing our eye for developing visual compositions that are impactful and harmonious as we play with and manipulate the different elements of art, such as color, shape, line, texture, value, etc. And we're able to focus in on enjoying laying down those brushstrokes, seeing what happens when you place a pigment on a wet area, and work in a more intuitive, less overwhelming way. Even as someone that has been working with watercolor for several years now, I really enjoy doing this kind of exploration from time to time. It's a way for me to relax while continuing to develop my artistic skills and making sure that I am keeping things fresh and exciting by pushing myself in different directions from time to time is, for me, one of the best ways to steer clear of art block. Alright, so before getting into the watercolor painting techniques that I use to create these pieces, I want to send out a huge warm welcome to everyone that is just visiting my channel today for the very first time. I am so happy that you found me, and do consider subscribing because every single week I share new videos with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement for aspiring artists. And if you do subscribe, don't forget to click on that little notification bell so that YouTube can let you know whenever I publish a new video, otherwise you may or may not find out about it. Okay, so to begin, even though this is an abstract exploration and it's very different from my representational paintings that I usually create, Some of the things that I do with my more representational paintings, I also applied to these. So for example, I am still working from very light and translucent to more dark and saturated colors. Another thing that I also make sure to always apply in both representational and my abstract pieces is that I always make sure to have the development of a large variety of different values and translucencies in mind when working with this medium. At the end, I want some areas of my painting to be very light and translucent, and even have some areas here and there in which my paper is shining through completely. I want other areas in which my color is very dark and saturated, and I want a wide variety of different values and translucencies in between. Another thing that I applied in these paintings is that I started with wet on wet techniques. In the beginning of this video, as you saw, I pre-wetted my entire paper and then started dropping in my pigment, creating beautiful wet on wet effects. And as the painting process moved forward, I used less and less water overall. In the later stages of my painting process, I stopped pre-wetting areas before actually dropping in my pigment. I started using a lot more wet on dry techniques and a less amount of water in my color mixtures. I think even in more intuitive style paintings like this one, it is important to at least visualize up to a certain extent so that you're able to have at least some level of control in the chaos. Because through visualizing, you're going to be able to get an idea of what techniques you need to use in order to get those kinds of effects. And it's also very important when you're working with watercolor to allow your layers to dry in between if you're looking for more sharper looking edges. So if you don't stay mindful throughout the process and at least give a little bit of thought to what might happen when you do a particular thing, then you could very easily create effects that you weren't intending to create. And this is especially important to have in mind, I think, when we're using watercolor, because with watercolor, we cannot really erase or correct mistakes as easily. We cannot just cover things up as we would be able to when working with things like acrylics or oils. So as I mentioned previously, those initial layers for both of my paintings were created with wet on wet. I pre-wetted everything and I started dropping in my pigment to create those very nice watercolor organic effects. And after that initial layer of paint, I allowed everything to dry completely because that was a point at which I wanted to start actually creating the organic looking shapes and carving out those darks. And I didn't want those organic shapes created by those darks to bleed into the initial color. Since the beginning, even though I had no idea what the end result would be and what the organic shapes created would look like, I had this idea of creating positive and negative spaces. I knew since the beginning that I wanted to make use of contrasting colors, and I also knew that most of the edges of these organic shapes that would be created would be sharp and defined, but I also wanted to make sure that these different shapes and colors looked somewhat integrated. And this is where the development of different values, of different textures, as well as the use of the other drawing and painting supplies that come in later kind of come in and integrate everything together. So even though I am working very intuitively, I still have these things in mind, and this is how I make my choices from moment to moment. Also, just like when I am working on a representational painting, I made sure to stay on top of water control. This is an essential skill to start mastering when you're starting out with watercolor, and I would highly recommend to anyone just getting started with this very tricky medium to start being mindful throughout the painting process of how much water is already on your paper, especially when you're using so much wet on wet, how much water is in your paintbrush bristles, and how watery your paint mixtures are. Because oftentimes accidents happen with this medium due to lack of water control. We start placing way too much water on paper that is already wet, or we don't realize we have such a large amount of water in our paintbrush bristles. or we start overworking our paper because we don't realize that wet paper is fragile paper and we must allow it to dry before going back in. Or another thing that I see happening all the time is that beginners don't visualize and don't plan for the effects that they are looking for. If you're looking for a sharper looking detail, then you must allow that initial layer to dry completely before going back in. You have to have patience to allow it to dry so that the lines or shapes or whatever it is that you want to place on top stay sharp and defined. So all of this, in my opinion, has to do with water control and staying mindful of how much water is already on your paper, how much water you have in your paintbrush bristles, and how watery your paint mixtures are. Throughout this entire painting process, I am constantly removing excess water from my paintbrush bristles by gently scraping the bristles alongside the top of my jar of water right there that I have on the side. And I am also constantly blotting my bristles on my absorbent towel. So throughout the beginning stages of both of these paintings, I used a lot of wet on wet. I pre-wetted everything with clean water, and then I went in and started dropping in my color, right? Right there, I am doing a second layer, doing the exact same thing. I allowed the previous light orange layer of paint to dry completely, and then I pre-wetted the kind of organic shape that I would be carving out with my darker color. And then after that organic shape had been laid down with my clean water, I started dropping in my purple. And I just allowed the paint to do its own thing. However, in the later stages of my painting process, after these initial layers of paint have dried, I am going back in with wet on dry techniques. I wanted to add in details into these paintings that were very drawn out and very well defined. And for this, it's of course very important that the painting is completely dry. Otherwise, the paint that you start placing on your paper is going to dissipate and blur out into the background. However, I also wanted to share about the bleeding technique with you, which is something that I use a lot for both of these pieces and often use for my other paintings. This is a technique that I love using to darken certain areas and add further contrast in my paintings. And it's an excellent technique to use when you want to darken certain areas and also want to create more natural looking gradients without using completely wet on wet. So in other words, whenever you need to darken a certain area but want those edges to be gradiated out, to be softened. And the way I do this is I place my pigment on the area of my paper that I'm going to be painting and creating that gradient in, and then I wash all of the pigment from my paintbrush bristles and go back in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush to run along the edges of that shape that I have just created while the paint is still wet. And this is going to create bleeding because the pigment is going to very gently expand, bleed into, and dissipate into the new area of wetness that you've just created with your clean and damp paintbrush. And you're going to see me use this technique over and over again to deepen and darken certain areas in both of these paintings in order to create greater contrast. All right, you guys, let's get into the 6 tips that I want to share with you today that are going to help you create more effective outcomes when you're working on these kinds of more intuitive, abstract, and mixed media pieces, as well as help the entire painting process just run along a lot more smoothly. Tip number 1 has to do with something that I previously mentioned in this video, and it's to always give thought to color prior to actually getting started with the painting process. Color is a vital element of art to start learning about as a beginner painter. And we have to start learning about the color wheel, color theory, color schemes, color psychology, and all of those things, because this information, this knowledge is going to enable us to know what exact color we need to reach for throughout the painting process in order to create the color mixture that we're going for. This information is also going to let us come up with amazing looking color schemes for the painting on hand, depending on the effects that we're going for and the message and the mood that we want to transmit. It allows us to achieve paintings that have a lot of harmony in them and allows us to create high levels of contrast if that's what we're looking for. We know exactly what kinds of color schemes would help out with that, whether it's complementary colors, triads, etc. or very visually pleasing yet subtle shifts in color, such as those created by monochromatic color schemes or analogous color schemes. We also learn about color temperature and how to use it in our color mixtures and to create impact in our work, and much, much more. Color is a super extensive and complex topic, but I would highly, highly recommend to anyone just getting started with painting to start looking into it and to start making it a habit to set aside at least a few minutes to plan the colors that you're going to be using for any new painting. Because if you just go about the painting process randomly picking colors throughout, this is most likely going to lead to a very incohesive result, to accidents and muddy colors while mixing, and also even to a certain level of overwhelm for the viewer when it comes to actually seeing your piece at the end. So unless this is your actual art style that you've developed, or this is actually what you're trying to communicate to the viewer on purpose, intentionally, then I would highly recommend to plan out your colors and stick to your pre-selected color scheme all throughout the painting process. Tip number 2, and this goes for pieces that are created via mixed media, I would recommend giving thought to the order in which you're going to be using your different mediums or supplies, because the way that you layer these mediums is most likely going to lead to different results. A lot of factors come into play when you're using different mediums, because some of them are more opaque than others, some of them are water soluble and others aren't. It's also important to consider whether you have to allow your painting to dry completely before going in. So for example, right here, before going in with my ink line work and my gouache, I made sure that my painting was 100% dry. Something else that I make sure to have in mind for my mixed media pieces is that I don't want to damage any of my tools. If I start using my drawing pen to doodle on top of wet paint, whether it's watercolor or gouache, I can end up damaging that pen. Also consider the longevity of your artwork, how long you want your piece to last. Many times I find that the greater amount of supplies I use in one same piece, the greater a chance there is for those different supplies, different mediums to over time not play well with each other and start kind of decomposing or breaking apart. So always consider when you're using mixed media how the supplies and the mediums are going to play with each other during the art making process, as well as what's going to happen over time with them. And if you need to, make little extra tests or do a little bit of research to see what you need to do in order for your artwork to last a longer time. Tip number 3 for these kinds of abstract pieces is to always have irregularity and variety in mind. Unless you're creating the type of artwork that is very structured and perfect and very symmetrical, such as maybe a mandala or maybe the kinds of abstract pieces that are created with very geometric shapes, such as op art. It's very helpful to have in mind that asymmetrical balance and irregularity throughout a piece adds a lot of movement to it, makes it a lot more dynamic and impactful. So I would say, unless you're actually trying to communicate a sensation of stillness, of something being very static and organized, then think of ways that you can bring in variety and rhythm into your visual composition. Think of ways that you can bring in rhythm into your piece without making use of organized patterns, because rhythm and pattern are two very different things. Think of how you can create variety within the parameters that you have already established for yourself so that you can make sure that everything looks cohesive at the end. So, for example, one of the many ways in which I made use of variety to create impact in this piece is through use of color. So, as I was mentioning in the beginning of this video, I constricted myself to using a limited amount of colors. But within that kind of limitation that I established for myself, I also, as I mentioned before, I made sure to create a wide variety of different values and transparencies. And it's this development of different values and transparencies, as opposed to using only one flat, solid value, that not only plays so well with this particular medium's translucent and glowy qualities, but also helps give this piece greater interest. And if you really want to create a sense of visual balance within your piece, then give thought to how you can create asymmetrical balance as opposed to symmetrical balance. For this, it's very helpful to start learning about positive and negative spaces as well as guidelines like the rule of thirds. Tip number 4 is going to be to at least do a bit of visualizing before getting started with the painting process. Give thought to where you're going to be using wet on wet techniques, where you're going to be using wet on dry techniques, whether you're going to have to allow a certain layer of paint to dry before going back in, and keep those ideas as general guidelines in your brain as you're moving forward in the painting process. Because yes, this is indeed a very intuitive painting process, but having at least a few guidelines in your brain and working mindfully when you make those decisions from moment to moment as you go is going to make it a lot more likely that you're going to end up with results that you love. It's all about keeping a certain level of control within the chaos. And the more you move forward in your journey and continue mastering your medium and learning about art fundamentals, the more subconsciously you're going to be applying all of these things. You're going to be creating harmonious, well-balanced, impactful pieces without really giving thought to all of these things at all, which is why it's so very important to start learning about art fundamentals. Okay, and lastly, tip number 5, and this is something that helps me a lot, especially when I'm working on abstracts, and this is to stay mindful throughout the process so that you don't overly saturate areas. And something that is very helpful for this is making sure that you are taking breaks and appreciating your work from farther away. When working on abstract pieces intuitively like this, it can be so easy to keep adding and adding and adding, whether you're doing splattering or actually painting in shapes. Whatever it is, it can be very easy to just keep going. And the same thing applies here as to what I was mentioning before with using way too many different colors. This overwhelms the viewer. It creates a very overwhelming outcome with way too many things. And oftentimes we need to consider that less is more, and we have to make sure that things look balanced and pleasing to the eye. As artists, I find that whether we're creating a representational painting or an abstract painting, we want to give thought to where we want to pull the viewer's attention towards and how we're going to be moving his or her eyes throughout the piece. And having in mind this balance between lighter and darker colors or higher and lower amounts of texture, higher amounts of detail versus less amounts of detail, etc., we're going to be making sure that we are giving enough impact to the things that we want to give impact to, and that we're also simultaneously giving the eyes a place to rest. It's important to remember that a visual composition is all about designing how everything is going to fit together as a whole. It's not about one specific part, but of everything working in unison to create one same message or communicate one same feeling or idea. And I am by no means saying that these little abstract pieces are masterpieces and are perfect, but I just wanted to share with you what is in my mind as I am creating these so that I can continue improving my artistic skills. All right, I'm gonna leave you now to hopefully enjoy the rest of this painting process. everyone, that is it for today's video. I really hope that you found it helpful and inspiring, and if you did, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I'm doing here on YouTube and allows more people to get to know about my channel. I would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Let me know which one of these two little abstract pieces you like best, whether it was the first one or the second one, and also if you like this kind of watercolor piece so that I can make sure to make more videos like this one in the future. Thank you so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe because I share new videos every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and stay inspired. Bye guys!